Welcome to Rocket Ship, the home of epic React Native content. I'm Simon Grimm, creator of Galaxies.dev, and today's guest is Britta Evans-Fenton, who's joining me from Canada. So thanks for tuning in, Britta.
Thank you for having me.
I saw, I kind of watched, we have to say I watched Britta's talk at the FJS because I had to leave early, but I still noticed that there are a lot of interesting things because the topic for today is accessibility in React Native and probably even beyond that because I'm an absolute noob when it comes to accessibility. So I'm already sorry for any kind of dumb questions I'm asking about accessibility. But before we get to that, a quick introduction. So you actually had your 8 years anniversary at Shopify recently. So you're a mobile dev at Shopify. Congratulations. That honestly, many people these days are like hopping jobs. So sticking 8 years with Shopify is kind of an achievement in the modern era, isn't it?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Basically, there's not many people who have been there as long as I have. And Shopify is not that old of a company either, right? Like comparing it to some of the other like Microsoft or what have you. So yeah.
When did Shopify start? Do you know? I don't want to put you into a bad position.
It's about 20 years, like just over 20 years.
Really?
That's like when it started in like a coffee shop. But yeah, like to give some context, I've been around, I think 96% of the company's been hired after me. So
that's so funny when you see those numbers, right?
Yeah, it's impressive. Makes you wonder like how much context you actually carry when you have that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you have a special interest in, your profile says animations and accessibility. I would also love to talk about animations. Maybe we can quickly jump into this in the end, but we'll go focus on accessibility. And I saw you were traveling the world. I found your TikTok profile. You've been everywhere, right? You recently climbed Mount Fuji. Is that correct?
I did. Yeah, I just come back from a trip to Japan. I had actually been planning that trip since joining Shopify, and I was supposed to do it in 2020, but we all know what happened then. So it had to get delayed, and so eventually it came out for this year. So,
how was it?
Yeah.
Was it your first time in Japan?
Amazing. It was, yeah. It was my first time in Japan. Japan's amazing. I don't know how I'm going to be able to travel anywhere else. Like some of the just like subtle like ease that you can have in Japan, traveling from city to city, shipping your luggage, like that's a luxury that I don't know how I'm going to live without in other countries now when I travel.
Are the trains on time?
They are on time. You have to be 5 minutes early because they are on time. Every once in a while, I will say Kyoto, the subways or the metro was not on time. That was like an exception to that rule. But everything else was very much on time. So.
In Germany, our train network is pretty good, but it's so not reliable anymore at this point. I just brought my wife and daughter to the train station. Like it was meant for like 12 p.m. And already up front, like she saw, okay, 10 minutes delay, 20 minutes. And until we got there was like an hour delay already. And it's always the same. Like, it's so bad because there was just the traveling from here to Hamburg. So no change of trains. But if you plan in like changing trains, it becomes so stressful because you have to calculate in like at least an hour. And it's, I don't know. I mean, train is good, but it's just no fun with the German train system. Krakow and traveling in Poland was actually a lot better, by the way. They were definitely on time,
That's amazing.
But anyway, we could talk a lot about trains today, but we want to talk about React Native. So I also saw you've been previously an actual iOS developer.
Yes.
Why did you move to React Native? How did that happen?
That was Shopify, actually. So I was an iOS developer at Shopify, and Shopify did the big push to React Native. And so I've been on React Native, I guess. I'm trying to think when we moved over. It would have been, I moved over. So I was one of the last people to move over. And it was closer to about 2021, I believe, that we kind of moved over, January 2021. So, yeah.
What was your first impression of React Native back then compared to like the beloved land of native iOS development?
So what's interesting, actually, to kind of touch on how I've been at Java for so long as well, I was what we called a dev degree student. It wasn't called dev degree when I first started, but they basically paid for me to go back to school. I had previously started I had started part-time to go back to school for computer science. And I decided I wanted to kind of like jump in, and they were like, yeah, we'll pay for you to go back to school, and then we'll shuffle you in the company a bunch of different times and get an experience throughout the company. It's kind of like a co-op on steroids. And we were able to, like, I was able to experience a few different things, including web, when we were moving over to React. And so moving over to React Native from iOS it reminded me so much of that experience of when I was like a very junior dev and I was moving over to React. So I was actually able to like hop onto it pretty quickly because I already had that base. I already knew that everything's a component and we all that. So like I was able to really define it and understand state because of that experience. So I definitely think that's a huge advantage when coming in from iOS, because there's kind of two camps, right? There's people who usually come in from like native development, or they'll come in from web and they're trying to work on React Native. And so, I mean, you could just start with React Native too, but I feel like usually you've got one of those two sides that you've learned first. And so you're taking that experience and using it. So I was lucky that I had kind of both before joining and working in React Native.
Yeah, I think if you understand both, it definitely makes it a lot easier, because people just coming from the web, it's kind of sometimes hard to opt into like this whole like understanding you ship an app and you maybe can't fix it. You have to roll out an update. It's not like you just upload something new to the server unless you use like code push. And there's a lot more to native apps that mobile developers need to learn. Yeah.
Exactly.
I honestly, I'm not exactly sure why Shopify moved back then. I'm not so good with the company history. So why did they decided to move from native development to React Native in the first place?
I definitely think there was like a bunch of reasons, but one of them was just to make sure that we were pumping out both an iOS and an Android developer build at the same time. Often those were slightly different variations. And so by having us all work on one code base and consistent through was an option. We also had a lot of React developers within Shopify at the time as well. So I think that definitely had an influence. But you'd have to talk to, I think, JML, who was the chief technology officer at the time at Shopify, was one of the ones who
I think I was reaching out to someone from Spotify before. I have to look this up. Yeah,
I heard the spot.
The
get that a lot.
No. Yeah.
No, but he's wonderful, and I think he's still working in React Native. He's got something else building up, so maybe another person to have.
I still need someone to talk about flash lists and stuff. You haven't been involved with. Have you been involved
Not
with
as
flash
much.
lists?
No. Like besides implementing it, like within the apps, but I feel like even more people have that experience. But yeah, Talha would definitely be the person to talk to, and I'm happy to give a bit of an intro to Talha if you'd like one. So.
Absolutely. Just yesterday I had a video about lists, and I marketed flash lists as a great solution. So that would be great. But going back to accessibility, maybe you start with, why do you actually care? Like, where does your special interest in accessibility come from?
Yeah, well, my grandmother had macular degeneration, and I, in the last like 10 years of her life, kind of started to see her vision decline and understand how she really was navigating the world. And a lot of that was through technology. She had this big giant magnifying machine in her living room that she would bring the newspaper to so she could read the newspaper. I had added a bunch of accessibility features onto her computer so that she could like still use the web like she had. One of her favorite like pastimes was just being on ancestry.com. And so she was constantly scrolling that. And so we needed to make sure that she could continue to do that. Even when she was volunteering, the organization that she volunteered with got her like a magnifying device. And so she was like, almost all of her world was through a screen that was often like magnifying or helping her or adding contrast, and I didn't realize how much technology was really involved, especially for an older population who wasn't as familiar with technology. That was a bit of a scarier jump for her, I think, than potentially like you or I could have to deal with. But yeah, so I started to kind of see that process, and I was like, oh, like we could really do much better as a society. And then a few years later, after she had passed, I took a DNA test, and lo and behold, I too have that gene. So it is very likely that I'm going to have macular degeneration, I should say. And so I often use the word, I think you had touched on this in a past podcast, but the concept of pre-disabled, I
Mm-hmm.
use that term. It is like an interesting term that I've kind of seen come out in the last number of years within the accessibility community. And I think it's a really interesting concept. It's just basically defining that at some point in your life, you probably will deal with an impairment, and just acknowledging that impairments do exist, and you're likely to have whether it's like it could be temporary, situational, or a permanent disability. Yeah, acknowledging that it's a community you might have to join, like the disabled community. So yeah.
If we talk about accessibility and disabled in this context, do we mostly talk about visual like problems, like you can't see, you can't read in the way you did before, or is there anything else included?
Oh, there's plenty included. I often say my bias is the fact that macular degeneration is something that is for eyesight. So a lot of the times you see people immediately say, "Oh, like I have there's screen reader use on my device," or they'll often refer to a screen reader as how they've made something accessible. But even something as simple as adding contrast, making sure that your colors are a certain level of contrast is really important. There's also like even just haptic feedback is sometimes considered an accessibility feature. There's keyboard use accessibility feature. Like it doesn't have to be vision. Audio, like someone who is deaf might be watching a video needs the closed caption, right? So there's so many layers to that, and just any sort of like barrier-free way of experiencing content or experiencing or navigating a system. It is important. So yeah, I'm like name dropping a couple, but there's just like endless amounts of that you can be aware of, and which sometimes is the scary part as a developer when you're like, I want to make the right decisions. I don't know what the right decisions are.
Yeah, but I think just what you brought up, the concept of we are all pre-disabled. If we could all adapt that more, I think we would already get into a bit better mindset. And I'm honest, I never really thought about it before. If you're like young, I would still count myself young. If you're young and healthy, you rarely think about those cases until you really like, just like you did, get in touch with someone who has these problems. So
Yeah.
maybe also like, what is there a definition of accessibility? What does accessibility mean or stand for?
Oh, that's a good question. I've heard a bunch of like really interesting concepts around the concept of like what it like whether or not you should be referring to someone as having a disability or whether it's an impairment, and the like actual issue is the obstacle. So that like rather than focusing it, so like a great example is potentially you are in a wheelchair, you use a wheelchair to maneuver, and you rather than understanding yourself as being the one who is disabled, understanding that it's the fact that there's no ramp that is adding the obstacle, and that is the impairment, that is the problem, not you. And I really love that term and that thought. There's a really good, actually, I'm going to name drop a book if I could. Like, there's a really amazing book, Demystifying Disability. It is, I've like name dropped it a bunch. I actually included it in one of the, I had like my last slide had a QR code and it included this information as well. It kind of talks about all the different ways that you can kind of define accessibility as well, and what the different camps of people, because not everyone also agrees, and that's another thing that you have to be okay with. So using like people first language versus identity first language. So people first language being like a person with disabilities, a person with vision loss, when identity first language is like very, very common for the autistic community specifically, as I said, the autistic community rather than a person with autism. It really creates more of an identity and understands that there's a culture and a community there. And so depending on like who you talk to will depend on how they've defined themselves, but also depend on how they are like, they like depend on what the terms that they use. So it's kind of a hard conversation. It's why I also like start my talks usually with a bit of a terminology, for people to understand just like what like what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, and like this is a really good book to help understand that. So that's why I'm going to recommend it. But yeah.
I will definitely put this in the show notes. I also will add your accessibility cheat sheet. That's what I found. It was at the end of your talk, and of course the talk as well. I'm going to include all of that. So probably accessibility is like making content technology usable for people who have certain impairments, certain conditions. That's
well, the idea
probably,
is that it's usable for everyone, right?
Yes.
So it's the focus shouldn't ever like, yes, the focus, there needs to be an understanding that there are people who have vision loss or low vision, who maybe are colorblind, who are like an understanding that that exists and providing a solution that fits for them as well. So it's less of a focus on just people with disabilities, but focusing on the fact that everyone needs to be able to use your content. It is a barrier-free experience, ideally, right?
Perfect. Yeah, that's a perfect transition. So, what happens if I don't do anything? Like, what happens if I just put out an app or a website and I absolutely don't care about accessibility? Will people be able to use that, or is it completely garbage in that case?
There is a level of use, but it won't be very. It depends on the. I should say actually, it depends on how you've created it. If it's a very, very simple app, there is a certain base level that is kind of built in. But if you go anything beyond that, you are going to need to add some sort of accessibility features and accessibility details. And it's very important to do so because we have a few different like laws that are put in place, including, especially I know you're in Europe, the European Accessibility Act is coming into play in June 2025. So that will create, I think it's like I heard that it's something like 3 million euros in fines potentially for not providing an accessibility, like having like a barrier-free experience. So it's very important that you get this going. It is based on the country, so every country has a different level of what there are, different set of fines and different set of. I don't know about the rulings that I'll have to look into. I don't want to speak for that, but from what I understand, the penalties are specific on the country and the type of interaction. But it's anyone providing, an organization providing a service or a good to the public.
I hope this is not ending up the same way that some other regulations of the EU currently affect us, like at some point maybe limiting us to use AI, or that we don't have like the latest Apple features on the iPhone. It's really, when stuff like that happens, it's really not that cool anymore. And I hope companies don't take this as an argument to say, oh, we're dropping app XYZ from the German App Store because we're not interested in implementing accessibility. So do you know anything more about this European Accessibility Act? Like, what do companies simply have to like provide accessibility in their, if they develop an application? Who's really checking that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think this reminds me a lot of some laws that have happened within Canada, and experiencing that is there's usually a lot of uncertainty going in. Mm-hmm. And I will say there's usually like huge fines, mostly to scare people just to start providing this and start becoming more aware. So I'm not sure if they've even figured that out yet. I don't know. I haven't really been following this specific act as well. I just know
it sounds very EU like just do some regulations. Let's put on big fines. It sounds like us.
Yeah. But there is one in Canada. There's the Accessible Canada Act. There's one in the US, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So like these do happen around the world. They have different deadlines and slightly different needs or wants. But I recommend WCAG or WCAG as a good resource for mostly for web. They do have they have a set of like standard. So there's A, AA, and AAA for accessibility, AAA being the most accessible. A is still accessible though, and that's something to like remind yourself and to consider. Most companies aim for a AA rating. That's a very common. I haven't heard of anyone who aims for anything different. But please do let me know if that's like, obviously I don't have insight of everyone, but I've noticed that most companies do kind of aim for that double A. And yeah, it's very good resource for that. They have a mobile, like, modified WCAG, which is like, I know it's the way to, you can say it either way. You can either say it as the acronym, or you can say, but I've heard people like scrunch it up, and usually when I say, oh, WCAG, they're like, oh, you mean WCAG? And I was like, yes. So I've just started saying it as well. But yeah, they've got really good resources as to like what you would need and what to think about in order to reach those accessibilities. So there's a bit of a standard. That's actually a huge problem within mobile in general, is there's just so many players in the game, because Apple and Android are very separate devices, that you kind of need to know some nuances between them, and they handle things differently, which is fun in React Native because you're pumping out both pieces of like usually both sets of code, right? So you do really need to be aware of both, rather than just specializing in the one with more of a native development. So yeah,
right. And we definitely want to get into a couple of specific React Native examples now that we've like got the terminology right, and like why it's
yeah.
also important because of the European Accessibility Act. So it's not just like something that maybe we can do this or not. It's really something that I assume, like, if I, as Simon, the little person, creates an app and there's no accessibility, I probably won't get a fine. But if like the big companies in Germany or in Europe are doing it, everyone's looking at them, and they will definitely be controlled and be affected by it even more.
Well, I did see as well a stat, something that must have been 94% of like users. So there was three different groups of users, but like one was screen reader users, one was like using a hardware within the context of in order to navigate mobile, but it was specific to mobile. It was 96% of users have like chosen a company based on their accessibility needs. These are specific to obviously folks who are using any sort of accessibility use case. But that's a great win. Like the fact that that's not being maybe talked about a little bit more as to, hey, this is like, this could actually win you customers if that is your motivation, or if that's the thing that you focus on as a business. I know that's not always easy to convince.
Yeah, after all, companies want to make money, and if you just say, hey, let's invest 3 months into making this app accessible, there's like no financial gain. Some companies will be like, maybe not. So if you can tie it to a financial outcome, that's of course also a way to make them implement it at some point.
Absolutely.
So you just said screen readers, and this is interesting because now we're getting into like the technical things more. I use my iPhone like I use an iPhone, but what is actually available for accessibility, like making my phone more accessible? You said a screen reader. What else is there? What are the tools that we can use?
I mean, there's a bunch in the accessibility features, and I encourage everyone to always like play around with it. The ones I primarily use and test on are screen readers and voice control. So screen reader on iOS is called VoiceOver. Being able to use your voice to actually navigate. Both are using the accessibility features or the accessible labels that you would see within React Native. But there's other things, like you can make your screens turn to like a grayscale, so black and white. You can add different keyboards. There's a really like fun Braille keyboard that I've been trying to learn, but I'm not as successful in that right now. But working on it. I'm growth mindset. I think I can do it. But there's plenty within that resource. But yeah, I do kind of focus on those two myself, because I do find them ones that I can actually use in day-to-day life even today. Like I would say I'm a casual screen reader user, primarily for at night when I don't want to look at my screen and I want to like get to whatever I need to do or grab information from my phone late at night and not have a screen blaring in my face when it's dark. So it's kind of how I've been actually like utilizing, because I want to make sure I know how to use a screen reader before I get to the point where
I actually have a hack for that. I learned this a couple of months ago from a podcast. Maybe it was on the Uberman podcast. So I set up a shortcut that when I press my side button 3 times, it turns into this completely red, so you can like this is not redshift or not like the Apple functionality is just like putting completely red over your screen so you can see it my phone. And this is how I
Amazing.
use my phone after 9 p.m. A little hack for
That's
everyone
awesome.
interested.
I
Then
wonder,
because
is
then you
that
can put
also
it
in the
up at night
accessibility?
and it's not. It's actually I don't know where I found this, but it's really
Okay.
just like putting the red slider completely to one end and blue and green to the other side. So
Oh,
yeah,
cool.
it's just a little hack. And by the way, I look for if you search for voiceover on iOS, you will immediately get to that menu point where you can activate voiceover. So I'll I will just do this. Oh my goodness, I never did this. I'm gonna have to play with this. There's also a tutorial. I got to explore this later. Um, it's talking, right? Stop talking. Not
Yeah.
yet. Not now.
I was going to say a Siri is a really good resource to turn on and off voiceover or voice control. And you were saying that triple click on that. My triple click is monitor. Like
I
that's how
see. I see.
yeah. So but I'm also very used to being able to navigate it back and around. So it
So
is not easy when you get started. There's a learning curve for sure.
So it is kind of complicated. It's a challenging topic. It is important, and there's like the European Accessibility Act and the Canadian Act. And now my question: why is there only one page in the React Native documentation about accessibility, and pretty much like not zero tutorials, but compared to my login with React Native tutorials, it's like there are not a lot of tutorials around accessible. Why is that the case?
No, I think a lot of it is just that the people who are coding in React Native, most of them are not dealing with the disability that they would require this type of information. And I also think that just web has done a really good job at providing these details. I know that's something that when I was chatting with folks from Meta, they were kind of saying that like the usual push is to go towards what web is doing, and there's a lot of resources in there already. So rather than be another resource in the catalog, kind of pointing you to the other ones, the other big parties, which is fine. But that is kind of one of the reasons why I think it's very confusing in mobile for especially in React Native when there are all these different competing resources, and you do have to know and understand some of the nuances around it. But yeah, I am encouraging more people. Like William Cagnon told me that he had added an accessibility section in one of his library documentations after talking to me. So I'm hoping that there's more of that and more just awareness and understanding that accessible features do exist, or if you're passing through certain types of components that they're already built in. But yeah, I would love to see more. I would love to see absolutely more and
You're
more
doing a great
content.
job of making it more popular. I mean, we're talking, and some people are listening right now, and they're like, "Hey,
Yeah.
maybe I should implement accessibility in my React Native app." So let's give these people some actual steps.
Yep.
I know that you can like set accessible equals true on a component in React Native.
Yeah.
What actually happens when I do that? Do you know what's going on in that case? Like, what is
Yeah.
changing?
So it's a very common like issue. It's like one of the first like troubleshooting issues that we get is people will add accessible, which is a prop, and it doesn't actually make things more accessible. What it's doing is it's grouping. So it's actually like essentially collapsing that component. Now I will say this is slightly different on iOS than on Android. Again, as
Of
as,
course.
as we do. So Android, you can still access and this is actually a really great feature that I will say Android's done a good job on. If there's a component inside that collapsed component that is interactive, you can still interact with it. But on iOS, you can't. So let's say you had a row, like we'll use flash list as our example, because I mean, I work on point of sale at Shopify, which it's just a bunch of lists. Like it's just like an app with a bunch of lists, right? I mean, there's a bunch of other connections too, but it's a lot of lists. Whether it's products or customers or orders, like you've just got lists of all those things. And so if there is a button on that row, and you've grouped that row to be fully accessible, you might not be able to access that button that's inside that row if those two things do differently. So nested components are not ideal for accessibility when using the accessible prop. But it is super great. Like in the talk, I kind of show what it looks like when you're navigating and you're not using the accessible prop. You're actually like looking at each and like every individual component. When you have a list that's maybe each row has like a title and a subtitle and like maybe some sort of like item on the left or the right, and you're going over each and every one of those elements. And so maybe on a phone it's not as obvious, but on an iPad it is very obvious when you're having to scroll through every single one of those components individually rather than grouping it as a row. And so I usually find that's a really good place to start, is by grouping components and understanding where the different elements that would be interactive are. So start by grouping that component, then focus on what are the different interactive elements, understanding if you have to break that component up into more than one interactive element, and kind of move forward from there. But yeah, all that with the accessible prop. So not
if I
always
had
accessible.
if I had like a row, the row has like, let's say, an image, a text, and a button.
Yes.
If I don't put in accessibility, like the label, what is the screen reader reading? Is it reading like image, text, button?
And it depends. That's a really good question. It depends on what other things you've put in. But if you've put absolutely nothing in, it will only read the text. And I guess it depends on what your button is. And it won't tell you the role for that button usually. So you do have to define that role to be button. So there is accessible labels, which are ways to kind of, usually like accessible labels are actually not as important as a lot of the other ones. Usually most of the time people are using text, and that's all you want. You want it to just say the text that's currently there. It does come into play if you want to provide more information, or if you are adding information to, let's say it's a button with an icon is one of my usual good examples. Like there's no text in there, so the app's not going to know, like the screen reader's not going to know what to actually say when you get over that icon, right? And so if you don't have a label there, then that's a problem. But if you do have a label there, you're good to go. But for most text, it'll automatically use the text that. So the label is just to override text that does maybe not existing. But you will need to put an accessible role on that button as well. If you want the image to be shown, this is where there's like nuances. If you want the image to be shown, you'll also have to indicate it's an image, and you would also need a label for that image. However, most images are often decorative when it comes to apps. So you do need to kind of be aware of that as well. If it's not providing any actual information or any like let's say if that image is like a map or a graph, like you would want information, you'd want to add accessible label into there. But if it's just an image because you want it to look pretty in there, and it's not providing any additional content, it's not, if you didn't see it, would it be a bad thing kind of thing? Then you actually don't need to provide any content. And that's actually one of the points I bring up in my talk, is just that so many people, when you start to add accessibility in, will swing the other way in that pendulum, and like you'll get all of a sudden everyone putting too much alt text in, too much content. You want things to be precise. Like even Wacom says, like you should really, with alt text, which is the label you would put on, it's a little bit more nuanced for alt text, but the label that you would put on an image, it's typically, you want it to be really short. You don't want it to be this long paragraph explaining the like item that's in the image. And if it's not providing information that's important for the user, don't put it in, because it's just adding chaos. So
yeah, I was thinking about like a list of blog posts, and all of these blog posts having some sort of AI generated image, and it's totally useless. It's just like, yeah, it's cool that the blog post in your list has an image, but you don't have to like just say it's an image with a dog or something. It's probably enough of information. So, okay, we got the accessible property. What are the other out of the box properties we got for accessibility? So you said a label. Is it accessible label, or how does it?
Yeah.
What is it called?
Accessible. Oh, now I'm blanking.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's sometimes. Wait a second. Accessible.
Do you know this when you say a word like 10
label.
times and you don't know?
I know. That's why I'm like, let me just confirm, because I'm like, no. Also, accessible and accessibility label are like accessibility label, yeah, because that's the other thing is that they use accessible for the accessible prop, but it's the accessibility label that I'm like. That's why an accessibility details are often in. So yeah, there's actually a decent number of like of properties and things you can put in within the accessibility details. I would say like the main ones you need to focus on are accessibility label, and that's to override any sort of like written content you want in there. It doesn't like if your app is primarily text, you probably won't have to deal with that, which is nice. That's already built in. Accessibility role is really important. This is normally for an element that's like interactive. You want to indicate that it's interactive, and that's also how a user would know how to like handle. So like if it was a button, a user would know to double tap to interact with that button so that they could navigate to something else or maybe add an item to the cart if you're looking at a point of sale. So they would know that by the accessibility role. We've also got accessibility hint. That's a common one that people accidentally mess up with label. So an accessibility hint is a way of just giving a little bit more details on how to interact with the element, or maybe a little bit more details on what that interaction would be or it would look like. So I usually use the example of like you've got the icon, like a search maybe that you want to implement, and you want to indicate that it's going to search for products, orders, and customers. You don't need the label to say products, orders, and customers. It's actually it's just a search. Like,
Right.
but the hint might want to say search for products, orders, and customers. And so understanding that nuance of dividing those things up so that a screen reader user can quickly swipe through. With hints, iOS users can actually turn this off. So if they're power users, they might not need it anymore. So think of things that would be helpful the first couple times that you interact with that element. But if someone's using that app over and over again, they might not need the hint or may not need to understand how to use it. Sometimes it's as simple as like understanding like sliders are a very common thing. Like I've noticed that like sliders will have their couple different ways you can interact with it. You could do like a double tap and hold, which has like a very particular like rhythm to it. And I've had to teach a few people that, which allow you to like interact with the slider, or some of them just is like a swipe up, swipe down. So having that hint is really important because when it says that it's interactive and I don't know how necessarily to interact with it in a case like a slider until I've heard that hint. So that's within the hint context. But those are kind of I would say the most important ones. There's also like important for accessibility, which you're starting to get a little bit more into like troubleshooting and making sure that you've got the right things going at that point. But as a good base first start, I don't want to scare anyone. I think those ones are probably the ones I would start with and make sure that all of my elements that are interactive have a role. Make sure that all of my elements and even things like headers are really nice to have roles to them too, so that people can understand like the information, how it's being presented. It's obvious to a sighted user. Let's make sure it's obvious to someone who is listening to the screen on what the hierarchy of importance is as well.
So it's good that we only have a limited subset here that makes it a bit easier to work with.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm thinking about adding accessibility to my app, what are probably some practical tips to get started? As you said, you can also overdo this. Like if I now go in, Britta told me I need accessibility, so now I'm throwing like accessibility on all the places in my app. That's probably not the best thing to do. So are there like practical recommendations you could give where people could probably low hanging fruits, but just like getting started? Because I know this first win and just feeling like, yeah, this is a way forward is always a good starting point for people. So where could people start with a bit of accessibility?
I mean, depending on how you set your code up, if you have a bit more of like component, like if you've componentized your app so that you're using like a bit of a design system, however extensive that design system is for you, Building it right into the design system is a huge win. That's a really easy way to start. So if you have a button component, make sure that that button component has the role rather than having to go through every single one of the instances of your button and to handle it that way. So you can get some really fast results by handling it with the design system, assuming that's what you've built in. If not, you're going to have to go to every instance and that you've used pressable opacity and add the accessible role button. But making sure that elements that are interactive have, like, every time you can click something, make sure that that's got a role. Make sure that elements that have that are important, any images that are important have labels. Any icons, determine whether or not you need them as a label. Actually, a good rule of thumb that I've often seen, and something that we've done at Shopify as well, is that the icons themselves don't have a label to them. However, because they're often seen as decorative things, they don't provide necessary information. If it's sitting in an interactive element, like a button, it's that button that's actually got the label attached to it. So make sure that your buttons have labels. What else? There's hints again are something that, like, a lot of them will actually be kind of pre-populated if you've put a role in there already. So I wouldn't even worry about hints unless you want to go that extra step. That's almost like that extra step. I would say labels and roles are really like the main drivers in making things as accessible as possible really quickly. And accessible component is another, like, they're the accessible prop, should say, is another element that's helpful. But in reality, it's like, that is, again, another nice to have more than like a need to have.
Okay, so really, like, searching through my code base, if I don't have a design system for touchable, opacity, pressable, button, and giving those the right role would be the first step to get started with accessibility.
Yeah. And understanding any elements that of those elements that don't have text in them, adding the accessible label there.
I think you also gave an example that if you have this sort of design system, you sometimes require a specific text to make the component accessible, right? So you're kind of forcing yourself to make sure you implement it, right?
Yeah. So depending on the type of, like, I always use that icon button is a really great example. That, like, the icon button, I need an accessible label for there, because icon doesn't come with, like, we've made the active decision to, like, not include it just because including it was adding so much extra text throughout the app. So we chose to make the interactive elements, the items that owned that label. And so button icon is a great example of something you need an accessible label for.
Okay, so these are the things that we can easily do. Now, the opposite question, and you already touched on it a bit, but are there certain things we shouldn't do, like we should avoid when we want to implement accessibility? I think you said, like, too much context or, like, throwing accessible on everything to group it together. Are there other things we should avoid when, like, trying to make our app better?
That's a good question. That's, like, I think the biggest one is definitely getting a chance to, like, putting in way too much content. So putting in labels that don't need to be there, or changing labels, like, that can be confusing, because you have to remember that someone who does use a screen reader may not be completely 100% blind. They might have some level of vision, and often do. It's something like 93% of people who are legally blind do have some form of vision. And because of that, we want to make sure that people are seeing also what they're interacting with. Like, so if you all of a sudden have, let's say, a text and you've changed the label to include more information, that's deceiving, and you don't really know what's going on. So making sure that it's the same content is always really important and always really helpful. I'm trying to think of other things, like, I mean, like, I guess it depends on how much you really want to dive into, like, important for accessibility, and like, making things not important for accessibility, like, being very aware as to what you are navigating. I always find that the best thing you can do is to test your app out manually. And if you're confused as to where you are in your app, that's a really good sign that maybe your users would be if anyone's using a screen reader. So getting a chance to kind of like run through almost like an audit yourself, again, I understand that it takes a little bit of time to learn and to navigate and to utilize, like to get used to it and utilize these new tools that you're learning. But who knows, maybe they'll be really important in the future. It definitely recommend getting a chance to do that. And voice control is really cool. Like I know we barely touched on that, but it's also using the accessible label. That's why one of the recommendations I have to keeping labels really short, especially on icons. Like if you look at that icon and you say, oh, that's a search icon, like you would expect that to be a search button. That's probably a good indication of what someone would say when they're trying to press that item.
Mm-hmm.
They'd probably say press search. But if you're putting that hint right into that label, as I was kind of talking about before, and that label says something like search for products, orders, and customers, that person is required to say double tap to search for products, orders, and customers. That's just a lot. It's a big mouthful because you have very limited time to do it as well. There's some really cool like hints and hacks around that. And I find voice control tends to be one of those features that is actually very, maybe I wouldn't say it's like user friendly, but like I think when people no longer can see their app, they're very lost in their app. They're not really sure where their app is. But at least with voice control, you're actually seeing the labels be presented. So you say show names and it will show all the labels so you can navigate. And I find that one tends to be a little bit of a faster learning curve on teaching people how to use it. It also helps because it guides you through, like it'll indicate other examples. So it's like, not that my pin for things is not 1111, but if I say press 1, it will press the 1. Instead of saying press 1 3 times, I can say like repeat 3 more times. So you can like navigate. And then if you get the prompt wrong, it will give you a suggestion on how to actually like say it differently. And you can read that and you can understand. So it almost teaches you, I find, a little bit better than voiceover is teaching. Like there's a little bit more of a learning curve there. But yeah, I like keeping labels really short, keeping labels in the right place, labels instead of pins, keeping alt text really short, grouping components so that it's a little bit faster to swipe through. I'm trying to think what else.
I mean, that's already great. That's definitely a good start for many people. And I will also try to embrace this in my app. And while we were searching a couple of minutes ago for the right name of the accessibility label, I also found one of the APIs called Accessibility Info, which is an interesting API. And I never noticed it until now. This is like the thing, when you want to buy a blue car, you see all the blue cars suddenly. The Accessibility Info API is interesting. It has a couple of listeners, like accessibility service changed or screen reader changed, where you can like subscribe to these things. And that's probably like the next level. Maybe that's getting me to AAA. I don't know.
So it actually is really great for certain things. Like we use that a lot when we're when we're changing focus. So if you have a screen reader enabled, the focus is changed. We obviously don't want to do focus changing when someone's not using a screen reader, because that could change when you're accessing keyboard and navigating through keyboard, how that would interact differently. So it's specific to when a screen reader is being used. I will say it doesn't have all the features that I would love it to have. So sometimes it will be able to tell you whether accessible feature is turned on, but it can't tell you which one, which can be somewhat limiting. But we definitely use the accessibility info in order to like understand whether we want to capture certain things. Also, just like if you want to understand the number of people using like your app, that's a really good way of indicating that. So you can get some numbers.
So you can include some tracking in those functions.
Yeah, if you were trying to get some data on the usage of your app. And the thing to keep in mind, though, I would say, like, sometimes that's not a good indication as to whether or not somebody needs those resources or needs that element. Maybe they're not using it because they know that your app is not ideal for it and it's easier to use it without. So just make sure that it's not the end all be all of the reasons why you you add or don't add accessibility, because that's not a fair assessment. As I quoted earlier, it's like 94% of users who need accessible features within on their phones have chosen apps purely based on the fact that one is accessible or not accessible. So I'm actually surprised that there's 6% of people who haven't had to do that. That to me is like, I think the more impressive stat within that. Because I would think if I am a screen user, I would like absolutely need to make sure that I'm choosing an app based on, or at least partly based on the fact that one of the apps is accessible and the other one's not. So
absolutely, yeah. So you said a couple of things were missing from that accessibility info API. Is there anything else that could be improved, you think, in React Native regarding accessibility in the future?
I mean, obviously, just having things built in would have been my ideal. I know that's something that like I've kind of like asked about in the past and been told that's a big breaking change that they're not going to necessarily implement, and that's fair. I do understand the reasons for that, but it would have been nice to have like button components to have just automatically the wrong button. We were really shocked that we had to do as much as we did when we were first building up the app in React Native. And that's kind of what made me more aware of the nuances. I had experience on iOS and web before, where there's a lot more of a culture to do this. And I think building up that culture is also really important. So whether it's through resources, I am trying to help giving talks, but also just like hopefully coming soon some YouTube videos as well, just to help people navigate that, especially as I see people ramping up on this, probably ramping up last minute to try to get all the compliance stuff with accessibility acts within their region. So I think building up more of a community, I think would be number one. And then because everything's kind of like usable after that, but that would be, I think, the very first step is building that community up and understanding and having more people aware. I was really surprised actually at the conference. I had someone come up to me and tell me that although they do all the accessibility on web, they had never considered doing it on mobile, which is like, and their app main target was the older population too. So I was just like, oh, this is like a perfect candidate for that. So I'm happy that I've been able to reach a handful of people like this, hopefully before they get sued too. So
I definitely feel like I should also do a video on this topic, because I've never really touched it, and there's really a lot to it, as we've talked for 50 minutes all about these things, and we could probably talk for another hour, because there's a lot to it, and it kind of feels like a new field to many people. So I would also love to wrap this up today with, we touched the practical steps that we can take, but with one last question that I also kind of personally had. Like, the main question is, how do I actually get in the right mindset to add these sort of things to my app? Because honestly, as I said earlier, I feel good, I feel healthy, I have no problem with my eyes or fingers or whatever could be a problem at some point in my life. Although, by now we all know that we are pre-disabled, but you know it yourself. It's kind of hard to imagine how you feel when you're 80 or something. So how do I get really in the right mindset to develop these features and not just take them as like a random task and I throw in some accessible labels, because the boss told me. So how do I get into the mental state of that better?
That's a good question. I think a really easy way, like social media is so around us, and there's actually a lot of really amazing content creators who are kind of like showing an insight as to what it is like to live with their disability. And so that's a really, really quick, easy way. Obviously everyone has empathy. Everyone is aware, and
hopefully
I was going to say, I'm going to correct my statement on that. I'm hoping most people have empathy. People kind of know that this is the good thing to do. And I try to remind people, this isn't just some fad. Accessibility is actually, it's more on the rise than ever before. Was it 55% of, they're expecting a bump of 55% of people with for specifically for vision, are going to need 55% more as they age. I'm trying to put that in a sentence. I'm so sorry that I'm like stumbling across this, but you can tell when I get really passionate about something because I start to like stumble across my words and I'm like, oh my god, what am I going to say? But the aging population, as you start to lose your vision, they expect that population to grow by 55% of having vision loss. Did that make sense? I'm hoping that did. I'm hoping you can piece together enough.
Yeah, it also makes sense if you think about it. Like the generation before us, our grandparents, they never really used a whole lot of technology. So yeah, some of them needed those features. But if our generation is getting to 80 or 90, we all have a smartphone. Yeah. We all want to use it in 40, 30, 50 years, whatever it might be when we're old. So this generation right now definitely has a need for accessibility in a couple of years.
Yeah. And go volunteer with like your local like Institute of the Blind, or go talk to, I mean, like what surprises me so much is like, I think it's like 1 in 10 males deal with colorblindness. It's not as prominent in women. But in the community, like developer community, like so many of the developers are males that I'm surprised that we're not even like color blindness is not really even talked about. Like when so much of that community exists, like I would say probably, but I mean, not that I'd be curious what the actual numbers are. I'm assuming like, I don't know, based on what I see, maybe like 8% of the population should in theory be colorblind of the developer community within React Native. Do you think that's a fair like assessment of like numbers? And so how is that? How have we not talked about that? How have we not like made this a very just like common standard practice within mobile apps or web apps? Or again, a lot easier on web, but maybe not as easy of a jump on mobile because there's just so many players in the game and telling you what to do and information's all spread out. With web, you just go to WCAG, to WCAG. That's it. Like that's the standard. Everyone knows it. It's built in, like it's easy. It also does a lot for you. Like it understands when something's certain different tags and it's like, yep, okay, cool. We understand this. So a lot of it's just like out of the box when you don't really have that feature as much in React Native. So.
Yeah, I noticed that I understand a couple of things about accessibility better now, but I also have to do a bit of research more to get more even deeper into this. But so far, I'm really grateful that you took the time here, Britta, today to explain the practical steps and a couple of things we can do with React Native. So maybe this inspires some people who listen to this or watch this on YouTube to implement it in their apps. If you do this, also drop a comment below. I will send it then to Britta, who will be definitely very happy if you add a bit more accessibility. So finally, I'm going to put the accessibility sheet in the show notes. Is there anything else or any other place where can people find out more about you and what you do currently?
Oh, that's a good question. Again, I'm starting my YouTube channel soon, so I can provide that information for you as soon as it's kind of up and rolling. But I think for now, I guess like, I don't know, I have a Twitter, but I don't use it as often. I should get more on social media. This is maybe a sign that I need to get more into social media and get, or no, it's called X now. I called it Twitter. Oh no. Yeah, I guess like you can definitely connect with me on LinkedIn if you're doing something similar to like, I love hearing what people are working on within accessibility and support them and see it's nice to see when the community kind of comes together with that. But yeah, I feel like maybe Twitter is the best option.
I will definitely put both Twitter and LinkedIn in the show notes. Okay, and also if you already have a link to your YouTube channel, I will add it as well. Because, I mean, your channel is probably going to be the best resource on accessibility in the near future. So thank you for taking the time. And I wish you all the best for the YouTube channel. And I'm expecting some great videos soon.
Well, I'm like, I have really good, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, really good heroes in this space, like getting a chance to look at your videos and stuff too. So I will definitely be taking notes, and I need a lamp behind me. I've realized you got the beautiful lamps behind you. And so
we can work that out.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Britta. Thank you so much for taking the time. Bye. Thanks for joining today's episode. My goal is to share interesting stories and insights into the world of React Native development. If you enjoy this show, please subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify. And on Spotify and Apple, you can leave up to a 5-star review. Because podcasts, and especially niche podcasts like this, are hard to find, subscribing and leaving a review does help me a lot. On top of that, check out my React Native courses on galaxies.dev that cover a variety of topics from getting started to building and publishing your mobile app. Finally, you can share today's episode with a friend or colleague who would enjoy the topic of the show. If you have any questions or ideas for future episodes, find me on X or leave a comment on YouTube. And last but not least, thank you for listening and happy coding. Simon.